Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield. We're very glad right now to be joined by Dr. Ramzy Baroud, who is a journalist, author, and the editor of the Palestine Chronicle. He's the author of 6 books. His forthcoming book is called Before the Flood, and it'll be published by 7 Stories Press. His other books include Our Vision for Liberation, My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, and The Last Earth. Dr. Baroud is a non-resident senior research fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. And you can find more about him at his website, ramzybaroud.net. Dr. Baroud, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. And I actually wanted to start pulling from a piece that you wrote back in March of this year called Beyond Western Hegemony, A Call for Middle Eastern Media Autonomy. And there are several points that I want to get into, but first off, you talk about what Antonio Gramsci called cultural hegemony, the idea that power can also be imposed not just through physical violence, but through cultural dominance. Something that you also point out that the Arab philosopher and historian Ibn Khaldun noted some 700 years ago. And we've had on the show before Mohammed Bamieh to talk about the issue of imposed structures, but the cultural question is really an insidious one, and one that's not discussed nearly as much as physical violence, which of course makes sense, especially during a genocide. But could you talk a little bit about this cultural hegemony, this creeping psychological occupation of the Palestinians, seeing themselves through the lens of the colonizer, the oppressor?
Thank you for that question. It's a brilliant start. I would even jump to this conclusion and then try to break it down. And that is, I think genocide and violence is the ultimate kind of testimony to the failure of cultural hegemony. When you can't break someone down using colonial domination, cultural hegemony, imperialist control of the mind, and the colonization of the mind, as is being said repeatedly, you have to resort to violence in the mindset of the colonizer, because violence is in some ways actually kind of explains the weakness of the colonizer, not his strength. A strong colonizer doesn't need to do so. He could actually colonize, and I'll tell you how this is manifesting itself in the Arab world, not in Gaza or Palestine. And the colonizer can, would rather win through cultural hegemony, would rather be able to sort out whatever conflict he has with the natives, while getting the natives on his side, helping out, donating their free labor, just being in a total state of submissiveness and submission, which is what we notice is already happening in many Arab countries. It's like our societies are broken down and they are controlled by regimes that they are not weak. I don't like that term, that we have weak regimes or quiescent regimes or failed regimes or cowardly regimes. To the contrary, we have regimes that are more enthusiastic to be on the side of the colonizer than the colonizer himself had expected. And that's the dilemma. I think that's the crux of the problem, is that we have a liberated, mentally, collectively liberated nation called Palestinians in Gaza. And on the other hand, we have nations that have flags and national anthems, and they are full members of the United Nations, but they are completely co-opted, completely colonized. And that's where the cultural component comes in. Palestinians in Gaza are free. I mean, they are as free as they come from a cultural point of view, in terms of narrative, in terms of discourse. We are free people. Sometimes we are a liability in the sense that our freedom is a bit too much. It makes a lot of people uncomfortable. It makes mainstream media uncomfortable, corporate media uncomfortable. It makes those who are trying to constantly find the middle ground between being, pro-Palestine and all the good stuff, but at the same time, they are very, apprehensive about being accused of being anti-Semitic, and they do recognize Israel's right to exist, but at the same time, the they have to pay lip service to Palestinians and to international human rights and so on. We make them uncomfortable because we are militant, because we have to be militant. We are free because we have no other option but to exercise the absolute and full limits of our intellectual freedom to waken the world up to this, travesty, this genocide taking place in Gaza. So Israel couldn't. Everything they wanted to do or they could do to control, especially Gaza. And I've been writing about Gaza since I was a teenager, and most of my books are dedicated to Gaza. It's just there is this collective decision that is made by Gazan society, generation after generation, that they cannot sit. There can be no white flag in Gaza. Under no circumstance there can be a white flag in Gaza. Israel used what we call the politics of humiliation. The rape that happened to many women in Gaza during this genocide, it's not just sexual. It's the kind of sexual violence that aims at breaking down society. Why do Israeli soldiers, humiliate Palestinians, film them being humiliated and put it on social media? The target audience are the Palestinians themselves, is that we are trying to control you, to dominate you, to break you down. And everything in their power has been done to achieve that. And yet they have failed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it reminds me of Huey P. Newton's book, Revolutionary Suicide, where he talks about how he was put in jail in solitary confinement and how he talked about how he was free, and he kind of laughed at the fact that they thought that they had broken him, but he was even in solitary confinement, he was freer than than he had ever been. And I want to talk a little bit about that Arab world seeing itself wanting to be like the colonizer even more than the colonizer realizes. But I wanted to take a little bit of a tangent here and ask you, because you mentioned specifically Gaza, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the psychology that exists in Gaza and how that's different than, say, the West Bank or Jerusalem, or like how is that different, or do you feel that it is?
It is different, and it has been different for a very long time. I think sometimes we feel uncomfortable as Palestinian intellectuals to speak about these differences because we are wary of the existing disunity that's happening at a leadership level. And therefore we feel that if we alienate the differences, we further contribute to the division of the discourse. But it is different because if we understand why it is different, maybe the West Bank can too be different. It's different because Israel has used Gaza as the one at the receiving end of Israel's greatest punishments against the Palestinians since the beginning of this so-called conflict. From the very, very start, the way that Gazans were treated, they were subjected to this psychological, physical, military, political, social experiment. A group of people crammed in a very, very small piece of land. Gaza, I mean, imagine the scenario. Gaza was crowded when 200,000 refugees were pushed out of historic Palestine into Gaza after the Nakba, during and after the Nakba. And total number of population in Gaza at the time was about 80,000. So, Bedouins and, the Gaza, Khan Yunis, aristocracy, Christians and Muslims and big families and clans. It was about 80,000. 200,000 addition to that number made it crowded. They did not have enough resources. There was a degree of starvation in Gaza at the time immediately after the Nakba. Imagine this same piece of land actually shrunk significantly because Israel has taken much of Gaza's arable land in order for it to use as so-called security zones. And military zones, and that's where the snipers are stationed. But even the sea itself has shrunk because historically the sea has been this kind of this endless gate of possibilities for Palestinians. The hope of the liberating Arabs used to be the sea. I spent so many days in Gaza sitting on the beach as a child, waiting for Arab armies to come and to liberate the Palestinians. It's something that we did. We knew that someone is coming at one point, and if they are going to come from somewhere, it's going to be the sea. So many beautiful days just spent in the breeze, just waiting for some navy to come to liberate us, and nobody did. But even that Gaza, that sea of Gaza has shrunk significantly to the point that fishermen are being shot and killed and attacked and arrested and tortured for daring to go beyond 3 nautical miles into the sea. And yet the population of Gaza now is 2.3 million. Well, however numbers survived of them. So we can just imagine the humanitarian catastrophe of Gaza, aside from the genocide, aside from the Israeli-imposed famine, aside from all of this. Gaza was already in a state of crisis. There are 2 possible outcomes of this kind of mistreatment of Gaza throughout the years. It's either Israel will succeed in this experiment and break down Gaza and present that model, that successful model, to the West Bank as a success story, and if you misbehave, you are going to be exactly like those Gazans, or for something like what happened on October 7th to happen, which is there's going to be a certain breaking point where the people of Gaza will not be able to take it anymore. The latter happened, and that's where Israel's real military crisis is. This is not about the occupation of Gaza. It's not about the so-called security control of Gaza, because Netanyahu and everybody else know they cannot control Gaza. The experiment of 77 years or more has failed. Gaza cannot be controlled, and therefore the only possible outcome that could be considered a win for Israel is to ethnically cleanse the Gaza population. Now, this is not repeated in the West Bank because the West Bank has much larger territories. The class distinction in the West Bank is much more, obvious. You have, there are some areas in Ramallah, if you go there, some areas in Tiri, in Biri, in Bethlehem, where you would see mansions you haven't seen anywhere. That's the truth of it. So there are class distinctions. There is class differences. There are people living in refugee camps like Jenin, and tens of thousands of people crammed into one single square kilometer in Jenin refugee camp. And on the other hand, you have this kind of massive, expanse of beautiful topography and land and landscape with villas belonging to these VIP holders of the Palestinian Authority. You don't have much of that in Gaza. The reality of Gaza was not enough. Yeah, there are some class distinctions, but the siege has kind of lowered the threshold of these class distinctions to the extent that more or less we can say that Gaza essentially is one single class. And this is what made Gazans far more unified in their resistance, in their idea of their collective fate, and in everything else.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to kind of jump back to that cultural hegemony for a second, because I guess the question, and I know that there's no silver bullet here, but the question is, what does self-determination mean when you have these insidious imposed structures? What kind of vision of freedom can you have if you're always looking through these lenses that are shackled to your face by the colonizer? What way do you see for places outside of Palestine to actually slough off this colonial hegemony, this cultural hegemony that's happening?
Well, I did explain how, we kind of lived and subsisted generation after generation in Gaza on the idea that the liberators are going to come from the outside. That did not actualize, and as a result, it forced us to rethink about the concept of liberation and its relationship to the internal forces of our own people, as opposed to looking at others for help. We are basically trying to find the answers ourselves. And as intellectuals, for example, we do what I call reclaiming the Palestinian discourse. Others refer to as the centering of Palestinian voices and that sort of thing. But the Palestinian peoples themselves, they understand that only their resilience, their sumud, and their resistance will make the difference. And it has to make the difference. We know that the Zionist project is in a state of crisis. As I said, a colonizer wants stability, a stability that is going to serve his interests. Netanyahu would love to have Gaza as being the Riviera of the Middle East, if you will, as long as the money and resorts and attractions are all generating funds for the Israeli government. He'd love to see Palestinians willing to accept a servile role as cheap laborers, and they would love to see our boys and girls being exploited in Israel, as indeed was the case for many years after the occupation of 1967. They wouldn't really mind that. And in fact, they are willing to, or at one point, they thought that they could, in fact, create a system in which they can exist with some sort of a caricature version of the Palestinian that does not harm Israel or does not, in the words of Netanyahu himself, threaten Israeli national security. That is the subservient Palestinian they are willing to work with. And in fact, they have. I mean, the Palestinian Authority is that caricature of a Palestinian. And they are happy to work with Mahmoud Abbas, but now they feel betrayed. They feel betrayed because, on the one hand, the Gaza experiment not only has collapsed, but is actually challenging Zionism at a global scale. And that's really the power of resistance. When we say resistance, we do not talk about Kalashnikovs. We're not talking about bullets and guns. We are talking about the very essence, the very revolutionary essence in the collective behavior of a nation. You either resist or you don't resist. And obviously that has failed in Gaza. And this is why the genocide is as irrational as it is in targeting women and children and animals and everything that moves or doesn't move. It is also rational from a secular colonial regime that knows that its existence can only be based on expansion and the complete oppression of the native. But on the other hand, they also feel betrayed from the Palestinian Authority, because this is not the deal. We agreed to give you guys money and VIP cards that would allow you to travel, to go and come back, at your own pleasing. But at the same time, we were expecting you, to fully rein in any Palestinian revolutionary idea or fervor or to suppress the resistance in any shape or form, and you have failed. And this is why Netanyahu is angry at Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. Is angry at them because he feels that everything that he has bargained for and everything he had constructed over the course of 2 decades is just collapsing. And he wants a third alternative, and he doesn't know himself what that third alternative is. So until Netanyahu come back with an idea that he might, deem workable, we're just going to see few hundred Palestinians being slaughtered on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about specifically like these plans, because of course now the plan, or the supposed plan, is a full-scale occupation of Gaza, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, considering the fact that there is no, as you said, there's no white flag being raised, and Israel has broken basically every agreement that's ever been made with any Palestinian authority, whether that be Hamas or other. So what is your feeling about that? And how do you see that playing out? And how do you see that then playing out with regards to the collapse of the Israeli government?
Right. So this idea, I think it's quite ludicrous that many, including many in Arab media, kind of play into this notion that Israel is about to occupy Gaza, as if this is this really like brand new breaking news that we did not know, existed prior. Just a whole new idea in the political discourse. Two important things. Number one, Israel has always been the military occupier of Gaza. According to international law, the United Nations made it very clear. And they made it particularly clear, the UN, when Israel decided soon after the so-called redeployment out of Gaza, I believe in 2005, under Ariel Sharon, when he was a prime minister, they came up with this idea that Gaza is a hostile foreign entity, and therefore Israel can deal with Gaza as if Gaza is this, independent country that can be attacked and defeated militarily. And this explains a great deal about why the nature of the Israeli war on Gaza changed after that particular law in the Knesset. It changed because Israel now does not feel that Palestinians are occupied people, or maybe who should be reined in or suppressed in the traditional, ways. No, but it can be treated as if it's a country that is attacking Israel. Therefore, Israel can respond with a great deal of violence and military determination. That said, the UN responded by saying, no, this is not the case at all. Israel is still the military occupier of Gaza, and the Palestinian people in Gaza are still occupied under international law. And nothing has changed, whether you decided to redeploy out of the center of Gaza City and go to the, to the so-called buffer zones. That's your choice, but the relationship doesn't change. So Israel, under international law, is still the military occupier of Gaza. Now, in addition to that, on the first or the second, rather, day of the war, when Netanyahu gave his first speech, he said that Israel is going to take total security control over Gaza. Now, the Israelis are playing this kind of with language. They are using certain kind of Hebrew words that mean something, but could, from a legal point of view, be argued that it means something else. So they have been talking about total security control, but not occupation. Total military control, but no occupation, and so forth and so on. But from the very start, that's what Israel wanted to do. They can call it whatever it is. They wanted to be in Gaza, and they wanted to control the population of Gaza. And they've tried. 675 days, 77 days, I can't recall exactly. But Israel has tried, and it has failed repeatedly, from the day of judgment to the general's plan to the Gideon chariots to everything else. Every single time they have failed. So when they come and say, no, we have decided to take over all of Gaza, starting with Gaza City, it gives the impression, and this is why sensationalist media reporting sometimes kind of feed into these misconceptions, that, so to this point, Israel hasn't actually decided to do so. But they did repeatedly, and they were pushed back in every single time. They tried to take over Khan Yunis for 3 months, then they failed, and then they retreated, then they came back again, and then they retreated again. So if Israel could have achieved that in the first week or month of the war, Gaza would have been occupied in whatever sense that Netanyahu has in mind. So let's not lose hope and assume that Israel is the one that is holding all the cards. And also, by making that assumption, we are denying Palestinians agency. Palestinians do exist in this picture, They're not just children who are starving. They're not just, grieving women and men over the bodies of their loved ones. They're also people who are fighting back. And in many ways, achieving what the entire Arab world supposedly tried and could not achieve over the course of generations. This has to be registered for the Palestinians. It has to be registered not because for the sake of intellectual fairness. It has to be registered because we need to build on this model. We need to learn from the sumud and the steadfastness of the Palestinians, and maybe those who are under the impression that they are free and liberated with flags and anthems, maybe they can take, kind of learn something from those who are actually redefining the very meaning of liberty and freedom and justice.
Absolutely. And I want to get into that a little bit more, because the question of media is basically like the lenses through which we see the world. And if people are hearing about Palestine from people who are, sitting in a comfortable studio in the UK or the US, that represents yet another imposed structure of perception. You're not hearing from the people themselves. And of course, just 2 days ago, Israel targeted and murdered 6 journalists in a tent outside of Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza, one of them being Anas al-Sharif, who had become known as the, quote, voice of Gaza for his remarkable and seemingly tireless reporting in the midst of a genocide, of course, just like any other journalist in Gaza that was also living through at the same time. And so I'm curious, with regards to that, what is the mandate in terms of, for everyone who calls themselves a journalist or anybody who consumes media, which, as we say about on this show, that's everybody. What is the mandate then for people looking into Gaza, for looking for voices from Gaza, for looking to understand what's happening there on the ground?
I think if we could just step back just a little bit, because there's some important context needed before addressing this question. You are looking here at a history of intellectual conversation and debate about the very essence of media. We've been talking about corporate mainstream media versus independent media versus indigenous media. And people like me on the margins of this conversation are always kind of yelling and jumping and saying, can you please listen to us and try to understand that maybe truth telling can only happen when the indigenous population itself becomes the participants, or they become the not just content creators, but the very producers of the intellectual production in the first place. We have been saying this for such a long time, and we have been dismissed as radicals and leftists and all the rest. But in reality, we are feeling validated now, yes, at the expense of hundreds of Palestinian journalists who have been killed and injured and maimed and tortured and disappeared. True. But you have to also denote this particular moment. When we said the New York Times and the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal and all the rest are deceiving their readers, deceiving their audiences, they are conveying either half-truths or completely fabricated political discourses that are centered within the Israeli political agenda. We were not believed, and we were pushed out of the whole media conversation altogether. But look at the situation now. Not a single international journalist is able to access Gaza because Israel has prevented them from doing so. Yet our understanding of the situation in Gaza, in fact, in Palestine, in fact, about the geopolitics of the Middle East, in fact, about the entire power paradigms within the global geopolitical paradigms, is much, much clearer than it has ever been in history. I have been to so many different countries since the beginning of that genocide, speaking, lecturing, listening, and traveling and conducting interviews. I go to small villages in the middle of nowhere, Abruzzo, Italy, or in Spain, or in small towns in England, and you will find Palestinian flags, pro-Palestinian graffiti, pictures of Palestinian prisoners. There is new global consciousness that is being built around Palestine. And this is not about self-congratulating anybody, but it's about asking the question, why is this happening within less than 2 years, which we couldn't achieve over the course of 100 years since the Balfour Declaration until now? Someone must have created the content. Someone must have contributed to this intellectual production. Who is it? Who is it? Let's be honest. The children of Gaza, the artists of Gaza, the journalists of Gaza, the writers of Gaza. Not even Ramallah. Don't even tell me the West Bank, because the West Bankers are being suppressed by the Palestinian Authority. They get arrested if they dare protest for Gaza. This is Gaza. So this should challenge so much. This is not even about the modernity of the media and the digital age and all of that. It's about kids creating content in morgues, in the streets. From some of the content comes from under destroyed buildings, where they are trapped under the buildings with their dead families, recording messages and videos to the rest of the world so that it will travel through social media and would reach millions and millions of people around the world. So Gaza has completely changed our understanding of where does truth telling even begin? Where does it take place? Honestly, I worry sometimes about when we are being told, for example, international journalists should go to Gaza. I worry sometimes because I feel total trust in the Palestinian people's ability to convey their narratives, and hardly a total degree of trust in international media trying to convey the same narrative. And this is why Anas al-Sharif and Hamad Grega and others were killed in Gaza. This is why 237 journalists were killed in Gaza, in addition to hundreds of intellectuals and bloggers and social media activists. This is why Israel finding them and killing them, because they think And that's the big mistake. They think that killing them is going to mute the voice of Gaza, but what they don't understand is that Anas al-Sharif and others are not random individuals who landed in Gaza, parachuted into Gaza, or came through the Rafah border into Gaza. They are Gazans. They are a reflection of the existing power of storytelling and truth-telling and information production that's happening in Gaza itself. In other words, no matter how many Palestinian journalists they would kill in Gaza, the power of the story narrative from Gaza will never, under any circumstance, become weaker.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, I mean, people don't have to be necessarily a specific journalist to be a storyteller. I mean, storytellers are coming from every walk of life. I mean, we've had on this show several times Dr. Khalil Khalidi, who's a doctor in Deir al-Balah, and he's also an artist. And just through talking about what it's like to be a doctor, or through his artwork, he is telling the story of Gaza, and he's not a journalist. So, and of course, this, as to your point, this is why they target the storytellers and the truth tellers. And I wanted to wrap up here just asking if you could, I mean, obviously your website is ramzybaroud.net, and I definitely recommend that people check that out. Also the Palestine Chronicle. But Ramzy, where are some places where you think people should look for what you're talking about, for the actual indigenous people on the ground who are not getting the story from somebody else, from an editor who's already messed it up, but like actually sharing the legitimate facts on the ground?
Absolutely. So, of course, the Palestine Chronicle and the Electronic Intifada are very good places to start, because the kind of the bread and butter of these narratives and these discourses communicated by these Palestinian-run media, independent media organizations, are people in Gaza itself. So we see ourselves as people who are just basically conveying the voices of those people on the ground, and that's the best we could do under the, the circumstances. And these voices cannot possibly be any more powerful or effective in the way they are. But I would say also try to explore social media. I follow children. There's a little child named Maria, who's about 6 years old. She speaks Arabic and English beautifully and fluently, and she shares poetry and Quranic verses, and she makes revolutionary speeches. In other words, I would say, immerse yourself in the voices of ordinary people on the ground. Create a network of these influencers, of these people on the ground, and in doing so, you will really build a bond that cannot, under any circumstance, be broken.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just speaks to the importance of doing that regardless of what the topic is. If you're curious about what's going on in the Congo or Sudan, or if you're curious about what's going on, in West Virginia, like, go to the source. Don't trust some talking head on Fox News or CBS or what have you. Dr. Baroud, thank you so much for coming onto the show and giving us all of this information. Again, folks, check out Dr. Baroud's website at ramzybaroud.net, as well as the Palestine Chronicle and the other points that he made. Thanks so much, Dr. Baroud.
Thank you, Eleanor. I appreciate it.